The biting wind of the Carpathians lashed at the faces of the 5 alpinists as they finally reached the foot of the majestic cliff, its summit lost in the leaden clouds. Fatigue pulled them down like invisible weights, but the anticipation of conquering a new height drove them onward. Alex, their unwavering leader, brushed the frozen crystals from his beard and pointed to a barely noticeable dark slit in the monolithic stone wall. "Look, guys, seems like some kind of natural cave. Maybe we can cut across and also get out of this piercing wind." A silent hesitation rippled through the group. The gloomy maw of the cave didn't inspire optimism, but the prospect of shortening the arduous climb and finding shelter from the bad weather for a while outweighed their concerns. First, Bogdan, the strong and silent one, squeezed into the narrow opening and disappeared. He was followed by Lena, fragile but incredibly resilient, then the self-assured Mark, always joking and encouraging the others. Last to enter were Alex himself and the pensive Victor, the group's geologist, always attentive to detail. Inside the cave, a heavy silence reigned, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the clinking of climbing gear. As they moved deeper, the passage became narrower and lower. Soon they had to walk hunched over and then crawl on all fours. "Looks like this shortcut is leading to a rabbit hole," Mark grumbled, his usual cheerfulness beginning to fade. When they tried to turn back, it became clear that their worst fears had come true. The narrow entrance they had crawled through now seemed like an impassable crack, too tight to turn around in. The stones seemed to have closed in behind them, cutting off their path to salvation. "Damn it!" Mark exclaimed in despair, futilely trying to squeeze back. His face, illuminated by the dim light of his headlamp, showed growing panic. A suffocating atmosphere settled inside the cave. The damp stone walls, covered in bizarre shadows from their flashlights, seemed alive, ready to close in. Time stretched out agonizingly slowly. Finally, Alex, gathering the remnants of his leadership composure, suggested moving forward. "Guys, panicking won't help us. Since there's no way back, we need to look for a way out ahead. Victor, do you see anything?" Victor, who had been carefully examining the walls, shook his head. "Nothing yet. Just bare rock and some strange scratches, like claws." They continued their torturous journey, sliding on the damp, slimy stones. Every rustle, every drop of water falling from the ceiling, made them flinch. The silence pressed on their ears. It felt as if the cave itself was holding its breath, watching them. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a piercing, blood-curdling scream. It wasn't a human cry of pain or fear, but something wilder, primal, full of insane agony. The echo reverberated many times from the unseen vaults of the cave, making their blood run cold. The alpinists instinctively huddled together, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Fear, cold and sticky like an icy fog, enveloped them. Even the usually imperturbable Bogdan paled. What was that?" Lena whispered, her voice breaking. There was no answer, only the ominous silence, which seemed even more threatening after that horrifying cry. They stood pressed against each other, afraid to move, afraid to break the eerie stillness. Finally, Alex, steeling his resolve, said, "We need to go. Wherever this passage leads, we can't stay here." They moved on, trying to stay close together, illuminating their way with the shaky beams of their flashlights. Ahead, a wider section of the cave appeared. The air here became heavier, and a strange, musty odor arose, reminiscent of rotten leaves and raw meat. And then, ahead, in the flickering light of their headlamps, they saw movement. At first, they were just vague shadows sliding across the walls. Then, from the darkness, they emerged. 6 bony, unnaturally long arms, covered in bumpy, deathly pale skin, appeared from the gloom. Their fingers ended in sharp, black claws that scraped against the stone, making a chilling sound. The arms moved quickly, independently of each other, as if belonging to some nightmarish insect. Behind the arms, the figure itself appeared, tall and emaciated like a mummy, but with unnaturally elongated limbs. Its face was hidden in shadow, but in the dim light, two predatory, hungry pinpricks of eyes glowed. The stench of decay became unbearable. Victor, pale as a sheet, croaked, "Wendigo." The very word, whispered, sounded like an ancient curse, a death sentence. The legends he had read about the evil spirit of the forest had materialized into terrifying reality. The alpinists panicked and rushed back, but the narrow passage that had seemed like a way in was now a deadly trap. The six-armed creature moved with astonishing speed, its clawed fingers easily tearing clothes and scratching skin. Mark screamed in pain as one of the clawed paws slashed across his face. Lena tried to slip past the creature, but two other arms grabbed her backpack, yanking her down with such force that she fell. Bogdan, with a desperate cry, lunged at the Wendigo with his ice axe, but it merely let out a guttural growl, and two more arms wrapped around his body, breaking bones. Alex's flashlight fell to the ground, briefly illuminating a horrifying scene. The bloodied bodies of his comrades, torn limbs, and the grotesque figure of the Wendigo, hunched over its prey. Then the light went out, plunging the cave into absolute darkness, broken only by the smacking sounds and the quiet, guttural growl of the six-armed monster. The wind howled outside, carrying the cold and silence of the mountains. No one ever heard the alpinists' cries again. Only the echo of their final moments remained forever buried in the dark depths of the Carpathian cave, becoming yet another chilling legend of the hungry spirit of the mountains. In the guttural darkness of the cave, sated with the remains of the unfortunate alpinists, the Wendigo stirred. Their hungry eyes, accustomed to the dim light, now greedily peered into the narrow passage leading outside. One by one, their bony bodies squeezing through, they left the stone womb. In the cold mountain air, there were 15 of them, a terrifying pack of six-armed predators. They moved silently, their long limbs nimbly navigating the rocky terrain. The scent of living flesh lured them down into the wooded valley. Soon, between the trees, they spotted humans, a small group of tourists lighting a campfire. The Wendigos lurked in the shadows of the dense fir trees, their pale skin blending with the moonlight filtering through the canopy. They watched the unsuspecting humans, selecting their prey. But suddenly, one of the tourists raised his head, as if sensing an unseen presence. His eyes widened in horror as he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. "What is it?" his companion asked. But before he could answer, the tourist screamed and bolted towards the lights of a village visible in the distance. The others, seized by panic, followed him. Hunger and rage flared in the hearts of the Wendigos. Having lost easy prey, they roared gutturally and gave chase. Their unnaturally long legs carried them with astonishing speed through the forest, snapping bushes and leaping over fallen trees. Soon, the village was very close. The tourists, gasping for breath and terrified, burst into houses, trying to slam the doors shut. But the Wendigos were already there. They easily tore doors from their frames with their clawed paws, their hungry eyes glinting in the light of the windows. Screams of terror filled the once quiet village. The six-armed monsters burst into homes, snatching the terrified residents. No one could resist their strength and speed. Soon, the streets of the village were stained with blood, and only bestial roars and death rattles echoed in the night air. By morning, the village was silent. Only 15 grotesque figures roamed among the ruined houses, sated with their kill. Their pale bodies were covered in blood, and only the desire for a new hunt reflected in their hungry eyes. The captured village became their new hunting ground, foreshadowing even greater horror for those who dared to approach the Carpathian Mountains. The legend of the Wendigo had become a terrifying reality. News of the captured village, carried on the winds across the surrounding lands, reached the ears of seasoned trackers, their reputation in combating the unknown as grim as it was effective. 10 sturdy men and women, armed to the teeth with an arsenal of traps and bait, piled into a battered jeep. Their faces, hardened by many perilous outings, held a resolute grimness. "Wendigo, you say?" A burly man named Grim growled, racking the slide of his shotgun. "Well, we've got a special welcome for them." The road to the village was rough, but the jeep pushed confidently through the dense forest. As they drew closer, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The air seemed stagnant, the birds silent, with only the occasional unsettling rustle of leaves. The Wendigo, whose keen hearing picked up the slightest vibrations in the earth, had long sensed the approach of strangers. 15 six-armed creatures lurked in the ruins of houses and the thick undergrowth on the village outskirts, patiently awaiting new prey. The hunters arrived at the deserted village at dusk. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows from the ruined buildings. The silence was ringing, deceptive. "Move quietly," their leader, a woman named Nora whose eyes sharply scanned the area, whispered. "Set the bait and traps. They're definitely around here somewhere." The group split into 5 pairs, each heading in a different direction to scout, their footsteps silent on the overgrown streets. They carefully set snares, liberally scattering chunks of raw meat laced with a soporific herb. The first group, Grim and a silent young woman named Anya, advanced along the dilapidated fences. They moved slowly, carefully examining every corner. Suddenly, from behind the crumbling wall of a house, a shadow lunged. 2 Wendigo, their pale bodies almost blending with the gray ruins, charged at the hunters with savage snarls. Grim, whose reaction was lightning fast, raised his shotgun. A deafening blast echoed, and one of the creatures howled, staggering back, its bony arm twitching. But the second Wendigo was already upon them, its 6 clawed limbs lashing out at Anya. Anya, despite the sudden attack, managed to leap aside. She drew a pair of hatchets from her back, their blades glinting in the dim twilight. With a piercing battle cry, she lunged at the monster, her movements swift and precise. Grim, having reloaded, fired again, this time aiming at the second Wendigo. The buckshot crunched into its body, but the creature merely snarled, seemingly barely feeling the pain, and continued to press its attack on Anya. Anya dodged the swift strikes of the claws, her hatchets carving deadly arcs. One of the Wendigo's limbs grazed her shoulder, leaving a deep, ragged wound, but the young woman didn't flinch. She deftly ducked under a swipe and plunged one of her hatchets into the monster's sinewy neck. The creature made a gurgling sound and recoiled. At that moment, the first Wendigo, having recovered from Grim's shot, attacked again. Now 2 of the monsters were bearing down on the hunters. Grim fired his shotgun, holding them at bay while Anya wrenched her second hatchet from the fallen foe. "We need to fall back," Grim yelled, seeing that they were being surrounded. But it was too late. 2 more shadows emerged from the ruins. The Wendigo, drawn by the sounds of the fight, were converging on their location. Grim and Anya found themselves surrounded by 4 enraged 6-armed horrors. Their chances of survival were dwindling rapidly. The sounds of the fight drew the attention of the other hunters. Seeing their comrades engulfed in flames, Nora commanded, "Molotov cocktails, now!" Bottles filled with flammable liquid flew through the air. They shattered against the walls of the ruined houses, erupting in fiery bursts that quickly engulfed the pale bodies of the Wendigo. 4 of the creatures howled in agony, consumed by the flames, but 2 of them, despite the fire, continued to attack Grim and Anya with savage ferocity. At that moment, the remaining hunters arrived. A fierce battle erupted. Gunshots roared, axes whistled, and the air filled with the smell of burning flesh and blood. In the furious struggle, 6 hunters fell, torn apart by the claws of the 4 Wendigo that had broken free from the flames. The 2 remaining hunters, Nora and a silent sniper named Kai, realized they couldn't win in open combat. "Fall back! Set the traps!" Nora yelled, firing as she retreated. They withdrew deeper into the village, quickly setting up snares and camouflaged mines in their wake. The Wendigo, driven by the scent of blood, relentlessly closed in. Suddenly, a sharp snap echoed as a trap was triggered, and one of the monsters howled, caught fast. A second later, a deafening explosion shook the air. Another Wendigo had stepped on a mine, its mangled body thrown aside. The two remaining Wendigo, having witnessed the demise of their kin, paused for a moment, as if sensing danger. They lurked among the ruins, waiting. Nora and Kai, hidden behind a collapsed wall, exchanged glances. "Seems clear," Nora whispered. They didn't know that the remaining Wendigo had merely retreated, spooked by the traps and mines, and were now waiting for the hunters to approach. Just as Nora and Kai decided the danger had passed and cautiously began to move forward, the two surviving Wendigo sprang from their ambush. But the hunters were ready. Streams of fire erupted from the flamethrower in Kai's hands. The creatures shrieked, engulfed in flames, and in a matter of seconds were reduced to charred husks. But victory came at a heavy price. Kai fell to his knees, clutching his bloodied shoulder. Deep claw marks were rapidly draining his strength. Nora rushed to his side, but it was too late. Kai looked at her with fading eyes, his breathing growing weaker. Moments later, he went limp, his eyes closing forever. Nora was left alone. Her body trembled. Tears welled in her eyes. Horror and grief gripped her heart. All her comrades were dead. She stood in the middle of the dead village, alone against an unknown number of remaining Wendigo, utterly despondent and terrified of what awaited her in this cursed valley. Nora gritted her teeth, trying to suppress the rising hysteria. Fury began to slowly displace the horror. Her friends were dead, Kai was dead, and these creatures were to blame. She wouldn't let their deaths go unavenged. She looked around. Ruined houses, charred Wendigo corpses, the bloodied bodies of her comrades. A plan began to form in her frantic mind. She knew the remaining Wendigo were out there somewhere, hiding and waiting. She wouldn't wait for them to attack again. She would become the hunter. Gathering the remaining ammunition and a few intact grenades, Nora moved deeper into the village. She moved cautiously, listening to every rustle, peering into every shadow. Years of hunting experience guided her on how to track an enemy even in these terrible conditions. She knew the Wendigo relied on their senses and sudden attacks. She would deprive them of those advantages. She would lure them into a trap using what she had left. Behind one of the ruined houses, Nora found the remnants of a well. An idea sparked in her mind. It might just work. Gathering all the flammable material she could find, she doused the ruins around the well with it. Then, she scattered the remaining bait, hoping to attract the creature's attention. Now all that was left was to wait. An eternity seemed to pass. The silence pressed on her ears, her nerves stretched taut. Nora concealed herself behind the rubble of a wall, clutching her last grenade. Finally, she heard them. Soft rustling, the snapping of twigs. The Wendigo were approaching. She saw their pale shapes and the eerie six-armed silhouettes flicker in the shadows. When the creatures were close enough, drawn by the scent of the bait, Nora sprang to her feet. With a wild cry, she hurled the grenade into the center of the ruins and immediately dove aside. A deafening explosion ripped through the air. Flames shot skyward, illuminating the Wendigo's horrified, contorted faces. Those too close howled, engulfed in fire. Nora didn't stop. Taking advantage of the confusion, she began to retreat, luring the remaining creatures after her, towards her prepared trap. She knew there were only a few left, maybe just one or two, and she intended to destroy them all. Nora retreated slowly, keeping to the shadows of the ruined buildings, her gaze frantically searching for the remaining Wendigo. She could hear their low growls, felt their presence lurking nearby. They were cautious, burned by the fire, but still hungry. Suddenly, one of the creatures lunged from behind a collapsed wall. Its pale body was scorched, but its claws were still sharp. Nora barely managed to dodge the attack, her heart pounding in her chest. She raised her rifle, but the Wendigo was too close. In a desperate attempt to defend herself, Nora dropped the rifle and snatched Kai's remaining axe from her belt. The blade glinted in the moonlight. She met the charging monster head-on. A brutal struggle ensued. The Wendigo was strong and fast, its 6 arms trying to tear Nora apart. But the woman moved with desperate agility, using every piece of rubble as cover. The axe in her hands flew, delivering quick and precise blows. One of her strikes landed on the Wendigo's bony arm, severing several fingers. The creature howled in pain and fury. Nora seized the moment and plunged the axe deep into its chest. The Wendigo convulsed and collapsed to the ground. Nora gasped for breath, her body trembling with exertion. She knew there was one more. She could feel its gaze, cold and hungry, watching her from the darkness. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the ruins. And then she saw it. The last Wendigo stood on the roof of a half-destroyed house, its tall, emaciated figure silhouetted ominously against the moon. Its burning eyes were fixed on her. Nora understood. It had been luring her. It had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike from above. Without hesitation, Nora sprinted towards the base of the house. She knew time was running out. She began to quickly climb the crumbling wall, grabbing onto loose stones and cracks. The Wendigo on the roof snarled and leaped down. Nora managed to scramble onto a shaky beam. Meeting the creature in midair, she swung Kai's axe with all her might. The blade thudded into the Wendigo's body. With a final, guttural shriek, the monster plummeted to the ground, dragging Nora with it. They crashed onto a pile of rocks. Nora lay there, dazed by the impact, feeling pain spread through her body. Above her loomed the still figure of the last Wendigo. Its dead eyes stared up at the night sky. Gathering her last reserves of strength, Nora pushed herself onto trembling legs. She looked at the ruined village, at the bodies of her fallen friends. Fury and grief washed over her. She had survived. She had taken her revenge. But at what cost? As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of gray and pale gold, Nora, wounded and exhausted, left the cursed place. She carried with her not only physical scars, but a deep, lasting trauma. The legend of the Wendigo had become her personal nightmare, forever etched in her memory. And although the village was cleansed, Nora knew that other such creatures might lurk in the dark forests of the Carpathians, and she would be ready for the next encounter.